the Climate Fairplay. This episode focuses on how all indicators show global climate goals are not strong enough to prevent the worst effects of climate change, and ends with a discussion on how cities like Copenhagen are working to achieve accelerated climate goals, such as net zero by 2025. Let's start with some stats about the current state of climate progress in 2024. There is not a single country that is meeting the target to limit warming from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius, according to the nonprofit The Climate Action Tracker. We're currently heading toward a 2.7 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures. According to the UN, if we are to meet 2050 net zero CO2 targets, greenhouse gas emissions must be reduced by about 43% by 2030 and 60% by 2035 from 2019 levels. We are less than 6 years away from our 2030 climate goals, and carbon emissions from fossil fuels reached record levels last year. In fact, of the 42 markers that the Climate Action Tracker measures, we are only meeting one: electric automobile sales. By 2050, the damages from severe weather are estimated to rise to between $1.7 and $3.1 trillion every year if we remain on the current emissions path. That's not to mention what's lost in terms of the natural world or human life. As climate tension is building, the United States is facing the decision once again if we're going to elect leaders who will act on climate change or leaders who deny climate change even exists. There's a high probability that the US, which is the historic largest greenhouse gas polluter, does a 180 on climate policy and starts pumping out unregulated carbon pollution. In this episode, we are looking at the fundamental reasons why globally climate goals are being placed to the side, and then shifting our attention to the cities that have adopted ambitious net zero climate targets. But with how important the 2024 US election is for climate policy, I want to start this episode comparing the different futures envisioned by the US presidential nominees. This is the Climate Fairplay podcast, a series connecting environmental news, science, and policy with community solutions. Subscribing on your favorite podcast platform is one of the easiest and most impactful ways to help sustain this podcast. So I will ask you to take a moment and hit the subscribe button. I'm sure you're aware of this if you're listening to the podcast. The environmental community has been vocal about the urgency of acting right now when it comes to climate change. The coming years are important for preventing the worst of the climate crisis. People are listening. The global consensus wants to see climate progress happen now, as we discussed in the first episode. The Paris Agreement is proof. It's been signed by 196 nations and has led to 140 countries committing to net zero targets, accounting for 88% of greenhouse gas pollution. There is momentum, but unfortunately, since these climate goals were first made, they've sort of been kicked to the side, much like my New Year's resolution to go to the gym. We aren't meeting climate goals, and the anti-environmental lobby is doing their best to reverse the policies that are good for the climate. This episode is focused on the current state of climate progress in 2024. But since this is the very start of the podcast, I don't want to assume what you may or may not know about climate change. So at the very end of the episode, I'm going to cover the basic background information on climate change. Now let's get on with the conversation on US climate policy and what Harris-Walz versus Trump-Vance means for the climate. The United States is a microcosm of climate tensions. Our entire society has been built on fossil fuels. It's hard to think of an area of the economy that they aren't fully integrated into. And this makes reaching net zero emission goals difficult because the scientific evidence overwhelmingly shows how greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels are the cause of climate change. At the end of 2021, the US will have emitted more than 20% of the total global emissions. One country, with just a fraction of the global population, is responsible for a fifth of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions. The United States energy, transportation, and industry sectors have built the foundations of a strong society here in the United States. They also account for 76% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the United States as of 2021. In recent years, the US has stimulated climate progress, yet the United States still is not meeting the nationally determined contributions agreed to in the Paris Agreement. Research shows a 6% emission reduction each year is required to reach the goal of 50% reductions by 2030. With how important 2030 net zero targets are, it's disturbing that the United States is putting all national climate efforts on the line in the 2024 election. If Donald Trump wins, say goodbye to any chance of the US coming anywhere close to the emission reductions needed to meet current US climate goals. The Republican nominee for president has called climate change a hoax, and Trump vowed to roll back environmental regulations and unleash oil and gas drilling. On the flip side, Kamala Harris was the tie-breaking vote in the Senate for the Inflation Reduction Act, which has provided the most funding in the U.S. for climate adaptations and renewable energy. In this election year, Vice President Kamala Harris and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz are making climate change a cornerstone of their campaign and have the record to back it up. U.S. climate policy is stuck in an infuriating, repetitious cycle since the Paris Agreement was reached. Every election, we are on the cusp of politicians who don't believe in climate change taking power. People who will eagerly pull us away from doing anything on climate change. Every time there's a major win with climate legislation, there's a constant backpedaling with how the U.S. approaches climate policy. This goes back to the Kyoto Protocol in 1992, when the U.S. initially signed the climate commitment, couldn't get it ratified in Congress, and eventually backed out altogether. If the U.S. pulls out of the Paris Agreement, we would likely see a domino effect of other countries forgetting about their climate targets. This election will be a moment for the U.S. to either commit to climate progress or backtrack everything we've done so far nationally and pretend the problem doesn't exist. Let's look at the options. Let's start with Kamala Harris's record on climate change. Her largest accomplishments have been as vice president in the Biden-Harris administration. As vice president, she's worked towards climate targets like reaching the 2030 nationally determined contribution of at least 50% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. The administration also has the goal for 100% carbon pollution-free electricity by 2035 and for net zero emissions no later than 2050. To my surprise, in 2022, the Biden-Harris administration passed major climate provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act, which Harris was the tie-breaking vote for. It includes the largest investment in renewable energy and adapting to sustainable transportation. The Biden-Harris administration devoted a $400 billion investment in climate funding to over 40,000 projects. Since the Biden-Harris administration took office, over $240 billion has been invested in clean energy manufacturing. The United States is on track to triple wind generation and increase solar generation 7 to 8-fold by 2030. And this investment will have a major impact on U.S. emissions. Researchers at Princeton University found this will cut emissions 43 to 48% throughout the entire U.S. economy compared to 2005 levels. At a minimum, we can expect Harris to continue to implement the accomplishments by the Biden-Harris administration. But based on Harris's record as a senator and as a presidential nominee in 2020, we can expect or maybe hope Harris will push for more progress. As senator, Harris co-sponsored the Green New Deal. She called for a climate pollution fee on corporations who pollute the most. As a candidate in 2020, she also called for a $10 trillion increase in spending towards climate adaptations by 2030. Harris's first major environmental justice victory dates to 2005, when as district attorney of San Francisco, she put together an environmental justice unit. As vice president, Harris also committed the U.S. to funding the International Green Climate Fund and is an advocate for international partnerships to address climate change. Harris is running on one of the best environmental records in history for a presidential candidate. Harris's commitment to climate progress also shows in her vice presidential choice, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. In 2019, he signed an executive order declaring climate change an existential threat. The order established a climate change subcabinet to develop strategies to mitigate climate change and enhance Minnesota's resilience. These groups developed a climate action framework with goals to reduce the state's greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The framework calls for increased funding for public transit access, EV charging infrastructure, forest and wetland restoration, clean energy, and public health programs. Governor Walz has championed multiple climate bills, including a budget requiring Minnesota to achieve 100% of electricity from carbon-free resources by 2040. Harris, as a 2020 candidate, did support a fracking ban and is now taking back that stance. Walz allowed a major pipeline to be built in the state, angering progressives and disregarding the Stop Line 3 protests. Overall, the combined record of Harris-Walz is one climate advocates should be beyond excited about. This strong record is also why environmental groups all over are coming to support Harris. I don't think it really surprises people at this point, but the Trump-Vance ticket is the complete opposite in terms of climate and environmental policy. Trump himself calls climate change a hoax, and his lack of understanding of the science shows in his policy positions. Starting with what Trump did as president. He removed 100 environmental protection laws, most of which centered on air pollution and emissions. Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement and global climate negotiations. He ordered climate change be removed from all government documents and agencies like the EPA. Trump wants to increase oil and gas drilling. At 2024 fundraising events and at political rallies, Trump has said he will roll back environmental regulations and unleash oil and gas drilling. He'd also do everything to stop the climate provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. He'd stop clean energy investments. He's talked about pulling EV credits. In addition to this, Donald Trump spreads a lot of lies about climate change, and unfortunately, people believe him. At this point, I don't think this is news to people. Everyone knows Donald Trump is bad for the climate and a friend to oil. But I still think it's important to talk about, because what voters choose will veer the course of U.S. policy on climate and environmental issues for pretty much the rest of the decade. So Americans, please step up and vote to act on climate change rather than pretend it doesn't exist. Research shows that a 6% emission reduction each year is required for the United States to reach the goal of 50% below peak levels by 2030. The good news is that the technology exists to reach our 2030 net zero emission goals. Renewable energy, public transportation, and sustainable food systems are proven methods of removing carbon pollution from our daily lives. In the second part of the show, we will examine the global barriers delaying climate progress and how net zero carbon solutions are being implemented at an accelerated pace on a community level. This August 1st was Earth Overshoot Day. Earth Overshoot Day is the date when humanity's demand on ecological resources exceeds what Earth can regenerate in a year. Every year, scientists calculate how many resources an average person uses and compares it with the resources available on Earth. In 8 months, we used up the complete natural resources our planet can sustainably provide for 2024. Scientists calculated this by comparing consumption of resources such as food, water, and energy, with the planet's ability to replenish. We are depleting Earth's natural resources 1.7 times faster than the planet can replenish them. The United States overshoot day was March 14th of 2024. If everyone lived on Earth like an American, we would need 5 Earths to sustain our consumption levels. I think this fact shows how our Western lifestyle is unsustainable long term without solutions to limit overconsumption of resources. It's also less of a surprise as why we're failing to meet climate targets when we look at it through this lens. If you are wondering how your environmental footprint compares, the resource footprintcalculator.org is linked in the episode's website. You can find your personal impact. I took the quiz, and based on my results, it would take 2.8 Earths to live the lifestyle I do, and I actively make an effort to limit my environmental footprint and live a sustainable lifestyle. Sharing facts like these spreads awareness and sparks important conversations. Keep this point about overconsumption in mind as we dive further into how we are falling behind on climate progress. You can find shareable graphics about this statistic and more on social media with the handle Climate Fairplay. The UN's global stocktake on every nation's progress of the Paris Agreement happens every 5 years. The first one happened this past November, and now countries are supposed to adopt stronger measures. But to hit these targets, every nation faces political resistance, much like the US tensions discussed in the first section. The results for the first stocktake found nationally determined contributions are short between 20 and 24 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. To help put this number in context, 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalent weighs 2.2 trillion pounds. As I highlighted in the introduction, there is an enormous cost associated with not acting. By 2050, it's estimated extreme weather events will cost between $1.7 and $3.1 trillion every single year, unless we veer course. With how much climate change costs, both in terms of the natural world and financially, in addition to there being such an overwhelming global consensus, I think it's worth talking about what's causing climate progress to be stalled and look at the communities that are overcoming these barriers and accelerating net zero climate solutions. After the Paris Agreement signing in 2016, there's been geopolitical turmoil unlike we've seen in modern times. I'll be quick with this. The COVID-19 pandemic stopped society, and the global economy is still recovering from the out-of-control inflation. Then, Russia's evil 2022 invasion of Ukraine, followed by the horrors of what's happening between Gaza and Israel. Since the Paris Agreement in 2016, the world is a different place with more global tensions. Russia is still invading Ukraine, and tensions in the Gaza-Israel crisis are rising. These tensions in the global world is one of the reasons why climate progress is falling short. The Paris Agreement was successful in getting so many countries at the negotiation table for a principal reason: climate commitments are failing. There's no enforcement mechanisms. There wouldn't be an agreement from the major polluting countries if the Paris Agreement had enforceable mechanisms for greenhouse gas reductions. So it also means climate goals can be missed without any real repercussions, even though it's technically a legally binding treaty. That's not to mention the fact that if every country was reaching the climate commitments set in the Paris Agreement, we'd still be falling short of the Paris Agreement's stated goal of holding warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. As I mentioned before, the UN conducts a global stocktake every 5 years to assess each nation's progress towards the Paris Agreement's targets. The first of these took place last November, and now countries are expected to adopt stronger measures. We will see if this actually happens because Every nation faces their own political resistance. Climate deception and lobbying from fossil fuel industries hinder progress. In the United States Congress, nearly 1/4 of members do not believe in climate change. The influence and ability of decision makers who don't understand science to delay meaningful climate legislation is frightening. I really think the US deserves better. I also think global climate negotiations' reputation is tarnished by these huge luxury conferences that happen yearly, often in high-polluting countries. For example, COP28 last year was held in Dubai, and oil and gas representatives were the most prominent force at these climate negotiations. Plus, there's the sheer audacity in asking developing countries to not use fossil fuel resources while developed countries delay promised green transition support, and they themselves rely on fossil fuels. To summarize very simply, the underlying cause for the delay in climate progress is the fact that it's a huge challenge. Our world runs on fossil fuels, and a large enough of the population doesn't understand the connection between fossil fuels and climate change. This has been a battle in environmental progress spanning decades, escalating since the Paris Agreement was signed. As we approach 2030, and we are faced with a serious chance that people who don't believe in climate change will lead the United States, I'm worried that the Paris Agreement will be a beacon of a better future we could have obtained rather than a future we're going to live in. I remember seeing a poll on Reddit shortly after the Paris Agreement was reached and before all the geopolitical turmoil happened, and was asking the question, what's more likely, World War III or humanity solving climate change? The overwhelming response had World War III as the likely outcome. People aren't expecting a positive solution when it comes to the climate. I think we will more often than not be disappointed by the progress of climate negotiations at a global scale, unless more attention is put into mobilizing action locally. The Paris Agreement has resulted in almost 250 cities adopting net zero carbon emission targets, with many much earlier than the 2050 climate goals. On a local level is where people can demonstrate successful strategies that can be scaled up and integrated into the global climate conversation. Plus, it's the most effective space to hold leaders accountable for meeting climate targets. The rest of the episode is dedicated to the cities who are achieving accelerated climate solutions. The Paris Agreement provides a global standard for climate progress, which we can hold ourselves accountable to even when our national governments aren't. This is shown in how local initiatives are driving net zero emission commitments. 252 cities have set ambitious targets and implemented sustainable practices. Some, like Copenhagen, Adelaide, and Nottingham, have even adopted city targets to reach net zero before 2030. Copenhagen is aiming to be the first city to reach this, with a goal of net zero by 2025. The city has been working towards net zero since 2013 and is in its final phase. By 2021, the city had removed over 72% of CO2 emissions compared to the baseline year. Copenhagen's population increased by about 22% to over 620,000 people. During this population growth, the city's per capita carbon emissions dropped by roughly 57%. Copenhagen's population increased by about 22% to over 620,000. During this population growth, the city's per capita carbon emissions dropped by roughly 57%. The city has focused on 4 areas: energy consumption, energy production, mobility or transportation, and city administration initiatives. The city credits cooperation with the residents, companies, and leaders, and this shows in the programs they've launched. Copenhagen has increased energy-saving techniques that reduce the cost of energy and consumption for residents. The city has also prioritized renewable energy, particularly wind power. A city's energy production and efficiency, I think, is the most critical component in reaching net zero on a local level. Copenhagen has been highly successful in this area, but as of the last public report made available, energy retrofitting is the main challenge in Copenhagen's climate plan. The city has been able to support energy retrofitting in its own buildings, social housing, and private buildings through urban renewal funds. But the city found 18% of the buildings in the city are still not up to the 2025 climate goals. The city plans identified new financing and business models are essential to make retrofitting affordable for people. It also finds simplified decision-making processes are needed where there is a backlog to allow homeowners to implement energy-efficient retrofitting. 67% of Denmark's energy comes from renewable energy. 98% of Copenhagen's households are connected to a centralized heating system. With the centralized system, a high volume of data can be collected. This has allowed the city to generate energy when it's being consumed and stop when it's not needed. Over 80% of the city's heating is carbon neutral. The remaining 20% of heating is still generated from fossil fuels, from the data I can find. The city utilizes biomass like scrap wood, straw, and waste products from people and animals as a primary energy source, which I think is a unique point. Copenhagen is actively exploring alternative energy sources, including large heat pumps that utilize purified wastewater or seawater and surplus industrial heat. Copenhagen has made notable progress in reducing carbon emissions from road traffic, achieving a 16% decline in emissions between 2010 and 2018. This success is due in part to the expansion of the metro network and improved cycling infrastructure. However, the growing number of cars and the increase in kilometers traveled, driven by population growth, continue to pose significant challenges. This city reported space and budget constraints have hindered expansion of green mobility infrastructure, such as charging stations and bike lanes. Despite these challenges, the rise in electric car adoption and shared mobility services is a sign for continued progress in reducing emissions. Copenhagen is one of the most impressive case studies in transitioning to a sustainable, carbon-neutral city. They have made major strides in reducing energy consumption and emissions through initiatives like energy-efficient building retrofits, widespread use of green energy, the shift to alternative fuels, and increasing public transit. I will highlight that the city is relying on carbon offsets to be a sink for the carbon that is produced by the city. However, Copenhagen is developing more ways to get to net zero emissions. Progress is clearly evident, and the city should be applauded for their ability to adopt these accelerated climate solutions. But continued effort is needed for Copenhagen to be carbon neutral by 2025. Figuring out how to create a net zero emission city is critical because 70% of carbon pollution comes from cities, and research shows 2/3 of the population will live in a city by 2050. In the United States, there are a handful of cities with 2040 net zero emission goals, like San Diego, California, Austin, Texas, and where I live, Denver, Colorado. I've read Denver's net zero implementation plan, and it mirrors the goals of Copenhagen, retrofitting residential homes and businesses, implementing renewable energy, and phasing out fossil fuels, as well as increasing public transportation methods. I've mentioned retrofitting commercial and residential buildings as one of the most common ways for homeowners to adapt to climate change. I want to end with this discussion, what this means for homeowners. Retrofitting is the process of upgrading existing buildings to enhance their energy efficiency and environmental performance. Essentially, it's updating older structures that weren't originally designed with modern sustainability in mind and improving them by adding energy-efficient features like better insulation, high-performance windows, or renewable energy systems, such as solar panels. The goal is to reduce energy consumption, lower utility costs, and decrease the building's overall carbon footprint. It's a practical approach to bringing older buildings up to current environmental standards. Trying to build a sustainable home is tough to tackle alone. There is financial support for retrofitting. For starters, there is a 30% tax credit on all new solar installations. I am also seeing a big tax incentive for installing heat pumps. Heat pumps radiate heat much more efficiently than traditional furnaces. Electric vehicles also have a sizable tax credit, which in my opinion has caused a pretty cool shift in the automotive market. I would also highly suggest looking into your city resources for retrofitting your own home. Denver has a pilot program for building retrofitting for people who are looking to upgrade their home to be energy efficient, and I'm sure many other communities do too. There is a lot covered in this episode. We talked about the significance of the US election on climate progress, how and why global climate commitments are falling behind, and what cities are doing to accelerate global climate solutions. From my point of view, this is a pivot point for climate progress. The US has a choice to elect a climate denier or a climate leader as president. If the US pulls out of the Paris Agreement, it will allow other countries to follow suit. The US could also show to be a leader in sustainable global development and technology. As we fail to meet climate targets, I'm thankful for what cities like Copenhagen are doing to show it's possible to build a sustainable future. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Climate Fairplay podcast. Don't forget to hit subscribe for weekly episodes. If you're looking for more information on climate commitments or about this podcast, head over to the podcast website at climatefairplay.com. Thanks again for listening. This episode is focused on the current state of climate progress in 2024, but there's a hefty amount of background information to understand how we got to this point. I'll be brief, however, you could write a whole thesis on each of these segments. Let's make sure we understand how global climate commitments came to be. The start of the global climate negotiations date back over 30 years to the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. There was undeniable scientific evidence showing human-sourced greenhouse gas emissions led to global warming. This is when the environmental treaty called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, was adopted. So, when it comes to making climate commitments, they've had a lot of practice at this point. The fundamental goal of the UNFCCC treaty is to stabilize greenhouse gas levels to prevent severe human impact on climate change. This treaty brings together 196 countries annually to discuss climate progress. This is the global stage for planning and enacting climate policy and action. The most critical conferences have been the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 and the Paris Agreement in 2015. The Kyoto Protocol is the first agreement to set binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions and was signed by 84 member countries. This ultimately failed, but laid the groundwork for the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was signed in 2015 by 196 out of 197 countries, and by all accounts is a huge victory in international negotiations. This includes all major polluting countries and the nations dependent on gas export economies. The fact that 8 years ago, climate targets like building a net zero future was considered a fringe idea, and now 140 countries have adopted this goal, including China, the United States, India, the European Union, the countries responsible for the vast majority of carbon pollution. It's huge progress, no matter what anybody says. The Paris Agreement is a framework with the goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius from above pre-industrial levels, while pursuing efforts to limit temperature rise even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is an especially ambitious goal, given that scientists already trace a 1 degree Celsius rise in global average temperature since the late 19th century due to the human emissions. There's just a couple more things to highlight in this episode to make sure we are on the same page. 1.5 degrees Celsius is the heart of pretty much every climate conversation because it's an environmental threshold. If we stay below this, we are on the path to a better future. If we cross it, the full consequences are still being studied, but the evidence shows severe changes in our environment. A rise in temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit will greatly increase the likelihood of triggering global environmental tipping points. Some of the most realistic and devastating tipping points are the melting of ice sheets, the massive dieback in global biodiversity, a slowing of the Gulf Stream, and the thawing of permafrost. But there are many tipping points scientists are studying. Climate change will also cause more intense droughts, a longer wildfire season, more severe and frequent tropical storms, and flash flooding. There's an undeniable body of evidence showing that the rise in temperature of human-sourced greenhouse gas emissions, like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxides, since the Industrial Revolution, humans have increased the carbon in the atmosphere by 50%. I have an episode published on the Livable Future podcast where I discuss the impacts of the Australian 2019-2020 summer wildfires. I have an episode published on the Livable Future podcast where I discuss the impact of the Australian 2019-2020 fires with an Australian environmentalist. I'll have this show linked as experienced recent drought conditions, with intensity projected to increase. Majority of the western United States has experienced recent drought conditions, with intensity likely to increase. The wildfire season in the western United States has extended by 200 to 300% in the past decade, leading to more Since the Industrial Revolution, humans have increased carbon in the atmosphere by 50%, meaning the carbon levels are at 150% from the year 1750. These gases stay in the atmosphere and trap heat, and research shows the cumulative effects of these greenhouse gases will have a huge impact on pretty much every aspect of our existence. I'll note that the climate is already changing our environment. There are more intense droughts, longer wildfire seasons, and tropical storms are more severe, just to name a few ways. I'll note that the climate is already changing our environment. There are more intense droughts, longer wildfire seasons, and tropical storms are more severe, just to name a few ways. The wildfire season in the western United States has extended by 200 to 300% in the past decade, leading to more frequent fires. Australia's 2019-2020 Black Summer wildfires burned over 5 million acres, fueled by unprecedented drought conditions. The Amazon region has also seen a doubling in severe droughts over the past 2 decades. I have an episode published on the Livable Future podcast where I discuss the impact of the Australian 2019-2020 fires with an Australian environmentalist. I'll have this episode linked in the show notes. I'll add 2023 was the hottest year on record, but scientists are already predicting with 95% certainty that 2024 will take this title. This is a headline that's already lost its meaning since every year is hotter than the last. I think this is a decent summary on climate change, its impacts, and international policy. If you have any questions, please ask.